Okay, so we're on. Hi, everyone who's watching. Hopefully someone's watching. My name is Adrienne Gennett. I am the Associate Curator of Collections and Education with the University Museums at Iowa State University. And today, for our second ever Facebook Live, I get to talk about some of the ceramics that are in the Contemplate Japan exhibition that is now closed at the Brunner Art Museum, but will be back open in the fall, luckily. And so we just wanted to highlight a couple things in this exhibition to talk a little bit about the history of Japanese porcelain and also the influences of Japanese porcelain on the Western world, both Western Europe and makers to today. I'm only going to focus on two pedestals here in the exhibition, but know if you want to come visit, there's actually other examples of Japanese porcelain and pottery, along with contemporary pottery by Peter Hammond, that is heavily influenced by Japanese porcelain, and he's making porcelain in Japan. But I won't talk about those at all, but there's more to be seen. So I'm just going to focus a little bit on the history today for everyone who's watching, or anyone who's watching, hopefully someone. Here you kind of see a little bit, a couple examples of both Japanese and European. And so first, what is porcelain? Porcelain is a ceramic body. It's a type of ceramic. You have earthenware, stoneware, and then porcelain. And porcelain is incredibly important because it's both strong yet incredibly thin. And so ideal porcelain you can actually see through. If you put your hand behind it and held it up to the light, you could see the image of your hand. Not like x-ray vision here, but kind of see the outline of your hand, because it's able to be potted so thinly because it is so strong. And so this was a very, very kind of important transition in ceramic industry, this ability to make an incredibly strong yet thin type of pottery. You know, stoneware, if you think about that, and earthenware tends to be a little bit chunkier a lot of times, a little heavier, has a rougher feel at times. Or if, you know, with glazing, it's all a little bit different, but has a different feel than if you've picked up maybe one of your grandmother's pieces of fine china in her house, and you can feel how thin and delicate it is. It's actually really strong. And so everything here we're going to talk about is porcelain today. Porcelain was first made by the Chinese in kind of the proto-porcelain was made in the Tang dynasty, so 6th, 7th, 8th century, so quite a long time ago. And then from there, they developed it further and further until the porcelain that we really know today, that continues to be made, was really being made in the Yuan dynasty, so around 14th, 15th century is the body and the shape and the type of porcelain that we really recognize today. And so it has a long history. It also has a long history of being something that people loved and coveted and needed and wanted and desired throughout the world. And that's a really interesting history too that I'll talk a little bit about when I talk about some of the European influences. So China was the only place that could make porcelain for a very long time. And so they had a monopoly, right? They were the only ones who could do it, so they're the only ones who can sell it. And they had a great industry going, and they still make tons of it to this day. And they made the best, obviously, because they were the only ones. And many people wanted to be able to make it too, but they also wanted it imported. So Japan was a country that was importing Chinese porcelain from about the 11th, 12th century. So pretty early, right? They already had trade markets going on. They were trading back and forth many different materials, and porcelain became one of those things. And at the beginning, it was only for the really wealthy. Only those with a lot of money, a lot of status could really own these objects because they were expensive and fancy. And as time went on, that changed a bit. And by the late 1500s, there were kind of changes in the tea ceremony in Japan and the ability of other people to have porcelain. And so the demand really ramped up, and people wanted these things at all levels, or at levels of society that could afford it. And interestingly, in Japan at the same time, you have the unification of Japan around 1600. So you go from all these kind of feuding states to a unified country. There's an emperor, but then you have the shogun, and he's the one who's really in control of everything. And so he really, from the top down, that trickle down effect of what people have and what people want. And he sets up a system where people have to come and stay in Edo the different lords and things like that. And so the people have to have objects, and so they are showing their wealth, and they're showing the ability to have nice things, and that they are important in their status through things such as porcelain. And so again, this new kind of consumption of porcelain is super high and really, really almost to the point where China can't supply it, in fact. And so very quickly on, Japan realizes, we need to make our own. And how are we going to do that? China's not giving away the secret to how to make porcelain very easily. And what ends up happening is that they have Korean potters who were taken in the in the 1590s. There was several different wars with Korea, or invasions of Korea by the Japanese. And some of these prisoners or other people taken from Korea to Japan were potters. And Japan really always appreciated Korean pottery. Korean pottery is also very high quality, really beautiful. And they really appreciated that pottery. And so those potters began looking for the right clays to make porcelain. And that clay that you need is a clay called kaolin. And luckily, around 1610, a Korean potter found it on the island of Kyushu, that southernmost island of Japan where they were working and living. So that was perfect. It was a huge deposit, and so they had the ability to make it now. If you don't have kaolin, you really can't make it properly. It's what makes it white and translucent and strong. You have to add in other things to really get the final product, but that can be patunci or alabaster or different types of quartz and glassy-like products to give it that extra strength and body. So they have the ability to make it, right, to start making it, but it takes a little while to make it well. And so by 1620, they're pretty consistent. They have the ability to make it. You also need to have higher firing kilns than stoneware kilns. And so they had to better develop their kilns so that they would be able to fire high enough. Otherwise you get a pretty subpar product if you can't fire. So you need much higher temperature kilns than they were using before. And so they work all that out. And by 1620, they're allowed to make something. They're able to make some things pretty consistently. But it's still very much for the wealthy. And they're doing the first types of porcelain are based on the blue and white Chinese porcelain that they're seeing. So they're imitating what they know. They're not really kind of delving out into new things quite yet. And so that's one type of porcelain. And then they start to kind of develop their own types and decorations and designs. And so another very confusing thing, and I'll talk about it a little bit when I go to the other side, is they're making this porcelain in a place called Arita, or these ceramics in Arita, and then they're shipping them out from the port of Amari, which is right across the way, which is very confusing because they're called Arita wares nowadays, but they're also called Amari, and Amari is a style I'll talk about, but Amari is actually a place. And so it's these names, with Western influences, just got kind of tagged and stuck to the styles and the types and the places, so it gets really confusing. And there's proto-Amari and Ko-Amari, these old types of Amari, and then there's 19th century Amari that we'll look at later, which is very different looking. So there's a lot of confusion and a little repetition. So I won't go too far into that, but I apologize if it sounds at all confusing. So they're doing blue and white, and then they realize around 1640 they develop the polychrome overglaze enamels. So before they're doing underglaze, right? So you're painting the blue on the actual pottery, then you're glazing, and then you're firing. And you can add other things afterwards, but these later, and you can tell the difference between overglaze and underglaze enamels, you can feel it. And so you can see the colors become overglaze enamels. So they figure out, it's not really sure if there's a Chinese influence, because the Chinese had figured it out too, but they weren't really making very much of it. And so it wasn't really accessible. And so it's a little unsure how they quite figured out, if it was on their own, if there was some Chinese influence, who knows. And so you get these colors, and these colors are really beautiful and bright and different. And so in the 1640s and 50s, they ramp up production, because another thing happens. China goes through a dynasty change. The Ming dynasty falls apart around 1644. They have a new dynasty starting. And so they don't have the ability, with kind of this economic and political upheaval, to make the amount of porcelain that they're making before. And so supply dwindles. And so what they have to do then is ramp up their production so they can start making as much as possible for themselves, but also for the rest of the world that wants it, which is great for them because they're going to create a market. And so in the 1650s, they start ramping up production. And another thing, I know I keep saying another thing, is they're going to start exporting, right? But many of you might realize or remember from your history books is that Japan's in an isolationist period right now. In the 1630s, the shogun kind of puts the clamp down on outsiders because he doesn't want those religious influences. And specifically, he completely shuts out the Portuguese from trading in about 1639. And it's the Portuguese that were trading all the Chinese ceramics to Europe at that time. And so they are effectively cut out, but a small man-made island across the Bay of Nagasaki is the only place where Dutch, Chinese, and Korean traders are allowed to trade throughout this entire period, up until 1853 when, you know, it's reopened by Commodore Perry, as we all know. And so there is trade happening and export happening to Europe and to the rest of the world and the rest of Asia. So there's inter-Asian trade, and then there's European and Western trade. And so these objects get to Europe through the Dutch. And the Dutch, whether, you know, the Dutch start buying some of these things, and the Dutch like to give wooden models so that you can make European forms of the porcelain, and then they're doing Japanese motifs and designs and styles. And so the color comes to Europe and is immediately obsessed about. They love it, they think it's beautiful. Looks totally different from the Chinese blue and white, has this extra color. And the Chinese aren't even doing very much right now. And so they fill in that void, but they're getting orders of, you know, hundreds of thousands that it takes them a little while to be able to keep up with that. And so that's kind of the history of the short history. And I'll get a little further right now to talk about kaikiemon. So there's different styles. I talked about the early kind of typical Chinese imitation, but then they start to develop their own styles. And one of the most well-known and really beautiful is kaikiemon. Kaikiemon, again, a confusing word. It's technically a family, but it's technically a kiln. So it's the kiln area where they thought these were first made, but then the person now who is the head of the family gets to call himself kaikiemon. It's really confusing. And now we call it the style. The style is kaikiemon. So it's super confusing. Again, I apologize. And but today we'll just talk about it as the style, because it was actually made in other places than just this one kiln that they like to think it was, that family. And so here you have a whole selection of European versions, and here we have in front of us the Japanese small saucer. So kaikiemon is noted especially for this beautiful white body that was called a nigoshide body. And it's very white and pure and highly refined. And so you don't see impurities or chunks of things in it. Sometimes you see that with less quality porcelain. It's very white, it's translucent, it's very beautiful. And so it's a great palette for painting all the different colors on. And so you see a larger expanses of white in kaikiemon, and then you see this very asymmetric, sometimes abstract imagery, always natural based. Here we've got two phoenix, so birds, those phoenix birds with their huge plumes. Actually, they look like peacocks, don't they? Sometimes it's hard to tell. So you've got a whole range of different birds that they show. And then here it looks kind of like the chrysanthemum. You often see plum blossom trees, pine, bamboo, there's tigers, there's lots of different animals. Every once in a while you do see humans, but more often than not, more natural based. And again, this kind of asymmetry, you know, this very, very kind of naturalistic look rather than a very symmetrical, you know, because in nature we're not totally symmetrical, right? Kind of beautiful, expansive white. And really, the really well-made ones have beautiful hand painting and artistry. And here we have examples of different European ones to talk a little bit about how this translated to Europe. And so you have people collecting in Europe objects like this, and they love it. Kaikeiamon is especially popular, and it starts being made in the 1670s, but it stops being made in about 1720. And it gets made again later on, but that then what creates a giant hole where all these European aristocrats are like, wait, where's my fancy porcelain gone? I can't have it anymore. And so they have to figure out, how can we make it? And so in Europe, they had been actively trying to make porcelain themselves throughout different countries. And the first most and very successful manufacturer to make it was Meissen. And so here we've got multiple examples of Meissen porcelain, this cup and saucer, and the other cup and saucer and little pitchers and sugar bowl over there. Meissen was the idea of Augustus the Strong. He was the Elector of Saxony. He was a little bit crazy for porcelain. He was actually insanely crazy for porcelain. He had thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces, including many examples of Kaikeiamon. So they had direct examples to copy. So it's a very long story, and it's a very crazy story of espionage and locking people in basements in Dresden castles to create porcelain. But luckily, this alchemist, who almost lost his life 1,000,000 times because he was kind of full of it, figures it out with a lot of help of a scientist. His name is Botger, the alchemist. And they figure it out, and so they're starting to make porcelain in Meissen around 1709. It's the first place in Western world that they can make porcelain, and the only place at this point. It becomes this huge secret that everyone wants, and that's where the espionage comes in, because people sell it and like run away, and then they get captured, and then they get killed, and then someone else sells it. So anyways, that's the only place you can make it, and they're figuring out how to make it. But by the 1720s, they realize they want to make the Japanese style, and so they use examples from Augustus' giant collection. And there's at least 2 modelers that are really well known, incredibly talented, who start copying that imagery. And so you can see here these ones. So this is circa 1725, this Meissen. So the coloring is a little bit different, right? And the flowers get a little bit more of a European style. You'll start to see a little less of a Japanese style, but otherwise pretty similar when you look at it. The patterning, how it's paced, and some of them are exactly the same. Another really interesting thing too is, but you have the form of a very kind of European teacup, right, with that kind of fancy handle. Another really interesting thing is that little brown edging that you see on both. I was reading when I was preparing for this was the Chinese would put a little extra lip of iron oxide before they fired it because they had trouble with their glazes contracting, and so this would kind of cover that whoopsie daisy. And the Japanese liked that. They thought that was beautiful, so they just added it to theirs when they were copying the Chinese, and then the Europeans would copy that directly off the Japanese. And so you all get this like funny little brown rim that was based on a mistake in theory, or an issue with the glazing. And you can see that on all the Meissen pieces, which is kind of interesting. The other Meissen on the other side are going a little bit further beyond. It's a very European forms, right? These are not Asian forms by any means. Actually, the scalloping of the bowl, maybe a little bit, but not really. You see these you've got the similar idea of expansive white, the scattering and asymmetricality of the imagery, but you have this big butterfly on it. So it's actually called Schmetterling. My German's terrible. Is the pattern named after the butterfly, and you see this pattern all over. But you also see this kind of like funky dragon, a very Rococo image, because a lot of these are based on silver models. So if you have a silver teapot that looks like that, you've got the dragon spout with the kind of freaky satyr head sticking his tongue out at you too. So it's all a little incongruous, right? Like it seems a little funky, but very popular still. And then the last piece we have right here is this big platter. And this platter in the center it looks almost Japanese itself, unless you picked it up and felt it feels a little funky. It's a little heavier. It is by an English porcelain manufacturer called Bow. And it is almost directly taken, the patterning itself. It's like a quail pattern in Japan, but the English were slightly confused by what quail were and called it partridge. And the partridges are always a little funky colored, like you're probably not gonna see a blue and green and red one in reality, right? But it's because it's still sticking with that color palette that is very kind of the blues, the reds, yellows, some greens is the basic color pattern for all Kaikiemon. And a little bit of black for outlining, but not much. So Bow and England is a little bit behind Europe. So you've got Meissen doing Kaikiemon, you've got France is also doing Japanese style porcelain and around 1730s, 1740s. England, they don't really start until 1750s. You know, England they probably got their Japanese porcelain from French traders and other merchants. And so they then start in the 1750s at a place called Chelsea. And Chelsea makes it for a couple years, about the mid 1750s, and then Bow starts making some when Chelsea stops. And this platter is, again, very, very kind of typical of Bow porcelain. That pattern was incredibly popular, and it looks just exactly like a Japanese. So similar. Even the flowers are more similar than the more European flowers you see in the Meissen. And so they make Kaikiemon this style until I think of the 1760s pretty well. And then when we'll walk over to the other side, I'll show you another English manufacturer that makes Amari, not Kaikiemon. So we'll walk that way. So over here we have some examples of what I was talking about, Amari. So this is 19th, 20th century. This is later Amari. But Amari as a style kind of came about very different from Kaikiemon. You know, Kaikiemon, as you saw, was much more, had a lot more white and open space and asymmetricality. Here you see this heavily patterned, dense color style of design and decoration. And this was very typical of Amari. And also this very bright cobalt blue, the red, the deep irony red, and then lots of gold highlighting. So it almost has a feel of like brocade or textiles in its patterning. You know, the original type of porcelain that was being made and sold through the Dutch was a type of porcelain called crack, and Kraak. And it is has this kind of these different, similar to this, it has like a couple panels around the edges and then a central motif. And that was really popular in that blue and white. But then when they start developing Amari, they start adding the other colors too, right? And making it different. And so in Amari, again, you get that really kind of dense pattern, but that was also very, you know, the Dutch enjoyed that because, again, they like that kind of crack, that style of more decoration. And then also in the Baroque Europe, you know, late 17th century, this is much more of an interesting style, fits more with the kind of heavy decoration that they're doing on a lot of art at that time in objects. And so here we've got the two in the middle, or the three actually, so that little cup, are all the Japanese version. So you see that scallop form plate and this little square cup. And it does come in, while they do European forms, of course, based on the wooden models that they're given by the Dutch. So you also see kind of square forms and square plates that the Dutch and others didn't really know. And so they get some new, interesting types of forms themselves in Europe that they find exciting. And again, if you look at this and see all the color on it compared to all the color, you know, the blue and white, this is going to be really wonderful and beautiful and exciting. So Amari is made throughout this period and heavily exported, but around the 1750s, or actually early 18th century, Japanese porcelain starts, the economy contracts, and so they are making less porcelain, so the industry contracts a bit. And China comes back, right? China has gotten settled, they're in the Qing dynasty, they're good to go. And so China starts making the Japanese wares and undercutting the Japanese to sell their goods. So again, it's a market, whoever makes the most and makes it the best and makes it the fastest and sells it wins. And so you have China coming back. So Japan kind of goes through a moment where they're not doing as much. And then in the, after 1750, they start to kind of come back. And then in the 19th century, you have again a huge influx of interest in Amari and this type of style. So these are, again, specifically from the 19th century. And this style becomes really popular, especially in America and Europe, where people are putting it in their china cabinets and it looks beautiful and it looks fancy. It's got lots of color, and so you get tons of it. We have a pretty large collection of this style, of all different patterns, stacks and stacks of bowls, and from the little bowl to the bigger bowl to the largest bowl to the little plate to the bigger plate to the largest plate. So you just see tons and tons of it. Again, in this kind of very decorative style. And this plate is really nice. This one's actually a really well done one. If you look at the dragon in the middle, it's quite lovely. Again, quality is here and there. Sometimes it's really beautiful. Sometimes it's just okay. It all depends on the maker, who's painting it. The quality can change really easily.
So we have a question.
Sure.
Lila Anderson says, these seem very maximal in design, which is different than some of the more commonly seen Japanese minimal porcelain. Can you say a little bit about the difference between these two aesthetics in Japan?
Yeah, so minimalism in general, she's probably talking because I sent her an article yesterday, is that the myth of minimalism in Japan, in that actually, we've created this idea that Japan and Japanese design is minimalist, but in reality, it's not. Through history, they've done, if you look at the prints in this exhibition, the ukiyo-e prints, if you look at the textiles, it's full of design and full of color. And even the Buddhist shrines, and actually Shinto I think is a little bit less intense than Buddhist. You have tons of design elements and motifs and decoration. And I think 20th century, we've kind of come to a understanding of Zen Buddhism and all this as meaning less and absence of design, when that wasn't necessarily always true. And so it's, yeah, absolutely. History changes and perception changes what we think about style and design. And so it'll be an interesting, we're going to talk about it hopefully in the fall a little bit, about how the history kind of informs the future and the present and what we think. And also, the article went into like Marie Kondo and how, as she's kind of given this aesthetic of should have nothing that doesn't bring you joy, right? But, it doesn't mean that things don't have to have any design, but that's my personal opinion. So you see these kind of over the top, right, design, fully covered in decoration. And this was popular in Europe too. And so here we've got examples by a porcelain manufacturer called Royal Worcester in England. And Royal Worcester was one of the biggest. They became huge in the late 18th century. So these are made probably around 1765-ish, 1770. And if you look at this one, it's pretty amazing. It looks very similar to other patterns and styles. And this is a coddle cup, so it's a very European form. And of course, you have got the little European top on it too, right? That you wouldn't necessarily find in other places. The pair on the my left. Again, very similar to what you find in Japanese, taken directly from Japanese design. You even see, these elements in other parts of Japanese art, right? Kind of the patterning. And these ones, for a while, I think were somewhat confused in our collection even, and someone had put them down as Japanese, but they're 100% English. And it doesn't help when, sometimes they would add just Japanese characters to the back and make it seem, actually I think these ones have that, make it seem like it's Japanese when it's not. This last one over here is kind of a great example of over-the-top European design, especially in porcelain, that is really, again, going far past. It still owes its kind of sensibility to Japanese Amari, but it's totally over the top. This kind of salmon scale, I believe they call it, patterning. You've got the cartouches, but they're totally like Rococo-like, even though Rococo is way past at this point. The branched handles with the flowers, the butterflies. So again, this is just going overboard and away from that, but exact, but still influencing, because as we know from this exhibition, Contemplate Japan, Japan had a huge influence in whether it was exactly taken or inspiring types of art later. You see that in all forms of objects, decorative arts, and fine arts throughout the world. Okay, so I talked really fast. But I think that's all. Again, we have more objects in the exhibition. We've got some satsuma, which was made specifically more for in the 19th century for exports. We have some examples again of contemporary pottery too, Japanese influence. And so it's really fun to get these out, and then also our Chinese collection of historic Chinese pottery to talk about how this was so important to the world and how these were traded all throughout the world and would influence what we all know today. You know, sometimes you think this stuff just exists in your grandmother's closet, right, or china cabinet. But it has a long history and a really important history of luxury and beauty and functionality along with all those. So I think that's all, unless someone has a crazy question for me. No?
None in the comments? I do have one.
Sure.
So was this used as a status symbol, as in you walk into somebody's house, you see they have the pottery and you're like, oh wow, or was it something that was also used and like had dinner on?
Well, yeah, and it changes throughout time. You know, as economics change and people get more money, people have more access. But, you know, early on, so when like Augustus the Strong's buying it, that is a total status symbol. He has the ability to buy it, so he's going to show it off, and thousands of pieces. And so at that point, not everyone can own it. Obviously, the more you make, the less it costs, the more, and you know, and England goes through the Industrial Revolution, so people have more money and more access with the middle class growing. And it happens throughout Europe and America too, so you have that access. In America, you get the same things coming, but you know, when you have Japanese or Chinese export porcelain was coming to America too, but again, it was like, you know, George Washington could get Chinese export porcelain for his presidential dinnerware that costs a ton of money. It took, you know, months to ship across after it was designed and painted. And now anyone can buy that. So again, it's the ability to make it, it's the ability to kind of supply the demand. But it was definitely a status symbol when people were able to collect it and show off, oh, I have this, it makes me, you know, fancier. Because I mean, if you think about it, like so many people have what they call china today that they never use because they've been told this is the nice stuff, you can't use this, which is silly because it's actually stronger or better than a lot of the stuff you might be using, the cheap stuff you're buying at Walmart or somewhere like that. And it's meant to be used, and it was used for a very long time, but it's become that idea that it's so nice we can't use it, it's too fancy, it was too expensive and too good. But that's also why it's handed down through a lot of times. I actually have a collection of, it's not, well, I have a little bit of Japanese from my mother-in-law, but late 19th century, a whole set from my husband's grandmother of English porcelain that they used often, and it shows, and it's beautiful.
How did the museum come to acquire all this?
Sure, so this, some of these are from Anne and Henry Bernier, specifically the two on the left. And then a lot of the Yamari, a lot of the Kaikiemon came from them too, because as you know, Anne collected everything, including Japanese, Chinese, ancient, yesterday, glass, ceramics, everything, dolls. So she collected a lot of that that's in the front. The Yamari, a lot of that came from a specific collector named W. Perry Allen, and he had a really big and great collection of Amari porcelain. That he then at some point gifted to us, I think in the 90s, Allison would know better, that we still continue to use to this day. And so he was buying from places in like San Francisco and California and other places like that in the 60s, 70s when this was coming in really popular. And it's still something that people, if they're interested in buy, you can buy really big chargers and they cost a ton of money and they're really huge, or you can buy simple things.
When will the exhibition open back up?
August 24th, hopefully, August 24th. Depending, on how everything goes with opening Iowa State, we hope to be open when Iowa State reopens, and kind of keep going from there and take it from there and have some limited capacity, of course, less people allowed in with some different restrictions, but hopefully here and ready for everyone to come by. Okay. Thanks.